How many times can a woman be rejected before she stops believing in hope? Margaret O'Brien was about to discover the answer. The wind cut through Pineville, Kentucky, like a blade on that January afternoon in 1923. At 2 o'clock, the temperature hovered at 28 degrees, and a thin sleet turned the packed dirt of Main Street into treacherous mud. Outside the Baptist church, a crowd of 60 men stamped their feet and blew into their calloused hands, their breath making ghosts in the frozen air. On a low wooden platform, Margaret stood with her 7 children, clinging to her skirts like drowning sailors to a piece of wreckage. Her wool coat, mended 3 times with thread that didn't quite match, was soaked through. Water dripped from the hem of her dress, from the red curls that had escaped her bonnet, from the chins of her children who tried so hard not to cry. Reverend Joshua Hayes stood beside the platform, a gavel in one hand and a sheaf of papers in the other. His face was drawn with the exhaustion of a man who had spent all morning trying to sell human beings and finding no buyers. 52 times he had asked for bids. 52 times he had been met with silence, or worse, with laughter. "Gentlemen," he said again, his voice cracking with cold and something that might have been shame. "Lot 17. Margaret O'Brien, widow, age 32. 7 children, ages 3 to 13. Opening bid is $40 for the woman, which includes transport and settlement fees for all 8 souls." A man in a beaver hat spat tobacco juice into the mud. "Too fat," he said conversationally, as if commenting on the weather. "And 7 brats? Might as well buy yourself a plague." Margaret felt Rose's hand tighten in hers. Her eldest daughter, just 13 years old, and already too wise, too tired, too afraid. Margaret squeezed back with a steadiness she didn't feel. Behind Rose, the other children stood in descending order like stair-steps. Daniel, at 11, trying to be the man his father had been. Patrick, at 9, still young enough to hope. Benjamin, at 7, clutching his sister's hand. Catherine, at 5, her blue eyes wide with confusion. Annie, at 4, silent as stone. And little Michael, only 3, sobbing quietly into Margaret's sodden skirt. This was what desperation looked like. This was what happened when a factory in Boston paid $6 a week and charged $7 for rent. This was what happened when your husband died of Spanish flu and the debt collectors didn't care that you had 7 mouths to feed. This was what happened when the Bride Bureau promised that Kentucky needed women, any women. They weren't particular. They had lied. Margaret thought of Boston, the 14-hour shifts at the textile mill, her fingers bleeding from the looms, the tenement with its broken windows and rats in the walls, the debt collectors who had taken everything, even Patrick's christening gown, even the ring her husband had given her. $340 owed to the hospital for trying and failing to save him. $340 she would never have. So she had signed the papers. She had sold everything that remained. She had taken her 7 children on a train that traveled south and west into mountains she had never seen, into a life she couldn't imagine, chasing the desperate kind of hope that tasted like copper in your mouth. And now she stood on this platform while strange men looked at her body and found it wanting. $35, Reverend Hayes tried, his voice thin. The sleet was turning to snow, fat flakes that caught in Margaret's eyelashes. Surely someone needs a housekeeper. The woman can read and write. She can sew. She can manage a household. Can she manage to stop eating? Someone called from the back, and the crowd erupted in laughter. Margaret kept her chin level. She had learned this in Boston, in the factory where the foreman's eyes lingered too long, where the other women whispered that she was taking up too much space, too much air, too much of everything. You gave them nothing. No tears, no pleading, just the knowledge, held deep inside where they couldn't reach it, that they were wrong. That someday, somehow, you would prove it. Behind the platform, Margaret could see Mrs. Cromwell from the Bride Society conferring with two men in dark suits. They kept glancing at the children, at papers in their hands. Margaret knew what those papers were. Orphanage commitments, work farm contracts, the backup plan for merchandise that didn't sell. "Ladies and gentlemen," Reverend Hayes announced, and his voice carried the weight of finality. "I am authorized to inform you that if no bid is received within the next 30 seconds, the children will be remanded to territorial custody under the Orphan Placement Act." 3 separate institutions in Kentucky, Ohio, and Tennessee have agreed to take them. The woman will be returned to Boston to settle her outstanding debts. "Mama," Michael whimpered, his small voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. "Hush, love." Margaret bent down, her knees protesting in the cold. She touched his cheek, red from wind and fear. "Be brave, just a little longer." She straightened and met the eyes of the men in the crowd. Most looked away. Some stared back with expressions ranging from pity to contempt to something darker, something that made her pull her coat tighter, even though it did nothing against the cold or against that particular kind of danger. None of them saw her, not really. They saw a woman who weighed more than fashion dictated. They saw 7 small burdens, 7 mouths to feed, 7 bodies to clothe. They saw work without profit, obligation without reward. They didn't see the woman who had kept her family alive through a Boston winter on nothing but pride and pennies. They didn't see the mother who had learned to set bones and stitch wounds because doctors cost money they didn't have. They didn't see Margaret, who could read Latin and keep accounts and make a single chicken feed 9 people for 3 days. They saw weight, and in their minds, weight meant weakness. "Going once," Reverend Hayes said. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. This was the moment her gamble failed, when hope revealed itself as the liar it had always been. Rose was crying now, silent tears tracking down her thin face. Daniel had his jaw clenched so tight Margaret could see the muscle jumping. The younger children huddled together, a knot of fear and fading hope. "Going twice." She should never have brought them here. Should have stayed in Boston. Should have found another way. Should have. $150. The voice came from the back of the crowd, deep and rough as a rock slide. Every head turned. A man stood at the edge of the platform, and Margaret's first thought was that he wasn't a man at all, but something carved from the mountains themselves. He stood well over 6 feet tall, broad through the shoulders, and thick through the chest, in a way that spoke not of fat, but of raw power barely contained. He wore a coat of bearskin, dark and shaggy, and his hair fell past his shoulders, black, shot through with silver. His face was all hard angles and harder lines, sharp cheekbones, a jaw like granite, and eyes the color of winter ice. A beard covered the lower half of his face, thick and unkempt, peppered with gray. His hands, visible where they emerged from his coat sleeves, were scarred and massive, the hands of a man who had spent his life wrestling with trees and stone and survival. The crowd parted for him, the way water parts around a boulder in a stream. His boots left deep prints in the half-frozen mud as he moved forward with the easy grace of something wild and dangerous. "Did you say 150, Mr. Thornwood?" Reverend Hayes sounded stunned. "I did," the man said. His voice matched everything else about him, low and rough, with an accent Margaret couldn't quite place. That cover it? Yes, that more than covers it. That covers her passage, the settlement fees, provisions for the children? Hayes blinked rapidly. All 7 of them? All 7, Thornwood said. It wasn't a question. His eyes swept across Margaret's children with the assessing gaze of a man evaluating livestock or timber. Then his gaze landed on Margaret herself. She made herself meet it, made herself stand straight, despite the trembling in her legs, despite the strange, dizzy relief flooding through her, despite the fear that came right behind it. This man was buying her children. She didn't know him, didn't know what he wanted, what he expected, what kind of life awaited them in whatever wilderness he had emerged from. But she knew what awaited them if she refused. Mrs. O'Brien, Thornwood said, and his voice was surprisingly measured for a man who looked like he could tear trees out by the roots. You understand what this is? What I'm offering? Margaret swallowed. Her throat was dry as dust. A marriage contract. Shelter and provision in exchange for domestic services. Something flickered in those winter-pale eyes. It might have been approval. That's one way to put it. Here's another. I have a homestead up in Black Bear Hollow, 2 days' ride from here through hard country. It's isolated. It's rough. The work is hard, and there's a lot of it. I need someone who can cook, clean, mend, manage a household. In return, I'll provide shelter, food, protection. I'll see your children are clothed and fed until they're old enough to make their own way. He paused, letting the words settle like snow on the ground between them. I'm not offering romance, Mrs. O'Brien. I'm not offering gentle words or easy living. I'm offering survival. You do your part. I'll do mine. Your children will be safe. They'll have a roof and they'll learn to work. That's the deal. You want it or not? The crowd had gone silent. Even the wind seemed to be holding its breath. Margaret looked at her children, at Rose's tear-stained face and Daniel's desperate hope, at the little ones who didn't fully understand but knew that Mama was the only solid thing in a world that kept shifting under their feet. She looked at Mrs. Cromwell and her papers, at the men in dark suits who would take her children away one by one and scatter them across 3 states like seeds in barren ground. Then she looked back at Ezekiel Thornwood, this stranger who had appeared like an answer to a prayer she had been too proud to speak. I want it, she said clearly. I accept your offer. Thornwood nodded once, sharp and final. Then let's get the paperwork done. We're burning daylight. The contract signing took less than 15 minutes, but each minute stretched like hours. Margaret's hand shook as she wrote her name in the ledger book Reverend Hayes provided. The last time she would sign as Margaret O'Brien, she realized. After this, she would be Margaret Thornwood, wife to a mountain man she had known for all of 20 minutes. Mrs. Cromwell pulled her aside while Thornwood was counting out gold coins at the Reverend's desk. The older woman's face was pinched with concern. Mrs. O'Brien, she said in a low voice, do you know anything about this man? No more than you do, I expect. He's been up in those mountains for near 15 years. Barely comes to town. There are stories. Mrs. Cromwell glanced toward Thornwood, who was methodically stacking coins with scarred, steady hands. Stories that he's dangerous, that he killed men during the war, that he came west to escape justice. Margaret followed her gaze. Thornwood looked up at that moment, meeting her eyes across the room. His expression gave away nothing. Mrs. Cromwell, Margaret said quietly. People have been telling stories about me, too. That I'm lazy because I'm heavy. That I'm a burden because I have children. That I'm worth less than $35. She turned back to the official. I've learned that most people's stories say more about them than about the person they're talking about. I pray you're right, child. So do I, Margaret said. They left Pineville within the hour. Thornwood had a wagon waiting on the edge of town, sturdy and loaded with supplies. He lifted the smaller children up into the back with the same easy strength he seemed to apply to everything, then offered Margaret a hand up to the bench seat. His palm was calloused, warm despite the cold, and large enough to swallow hers completely. Thank you, she said automatically. He grunted something that might have been acknowledgement and rounded the wagon to take the driver's seat. The older children, Rose, Daniel, and Patrick, sat in the back with the supplies and the little ones. Margaret could hear them whispering, but they were behaving themselves. They knew better than to cause trouble when things were uncertain. Thornwood clicked his tongue, and the horses started forward, pulling the wagon away from the church and the crowd and the life that might have been. Margaret didn't look back. There was nothing behind her worth seeing. They traveled in silence for the first hour, following a rough trail that led away from town and toward the mountains. The land here was wild and beautiful in a harsh way. Rolling hills, covered in bare trees and tough grass. Stands of pine in the distance, and above it all, the mountains rising like the teeth of some vast, sleeping creature against the gray sky. Margaret had never seen anything like it. Boston had been brick and smoke and crowded streets where the buildings blocked out the sun. This was space and silence, broken only by the creak of the wagon and the steady rhythm of hooves on frozen ground. "You warm enough?" Thornwood asked suddenly. Margaret started. It was the first thing he had said since they left town. "Yes, thank you." Another silence fell. Then, "Got blankets in the back if you need them. For the kids, too." "We're managing." Thornwood nodded, and they drove on. Margaret studied him from the corner of her eye. In the better light, away from the crowd, she could see details she had missed before. He was probably in his mid-40s, though the lines around his eyes and mouth could have added years. There was a scar along his left cheek, old and white against his weathered skin. His hands on the reins were steady and sure. He sat easy on the bench, comfortable with the movement of the wagon, his body relaxed despite his size. He didn't seem cruel. He didn't seem gentle either. He seemed remote, like a man who had spent so long alone that he had forgotten how to be otherwise. After 10 minutes more, Thornwood pulled the wagon to a stop. Without a word, he climbed down and went to the back. Margaret heard him rummaging through supplies. Then he appeared beside Rose, holding something wrapped in cloth. "Honey cakes," he said gruffly, handing the package to the girl. 7 of them. Share them out. And here." He produced a jar of milk. "It's still warm. Don't let the little ones have it all at once, or they'll be sick." Rose took the offerings with wide eyes. "You prepared this? For us? Saw you kids standing in the cold back there. Figured you'd be hungry." Thornwood's expression didn't change. "Make sure everyone gets some, including your mother." He climbed back onto the bench and set the wagon moving again before Rose could respond. In the back, Margaret could hear the children devouring the unexpected feast. Little Michael made a sound of pure joy at the taste of honey and butter. Annie, who hadn't made a sound in 3 days, hummed softly. Margaret felt her throat tighten with emotion she couldn't name. "Mrs. Thornwood," he said, and Margaret realized with a start that was her name now. "You need to eat too." Can't have anyone in my household going hungry. The children need it more. Got plenty more. Eat. It wasn't a request. Rose passed a honey cake forward, and Margaret took it with trembling hands. The first bite tasted like heaven, like hope, like the possibility that maybe, just maybe, they would be all right. Patrick's voice piped up from the back, curious and fearless, in the way only a 9-year-old could be. "Mr. Thornwood, sir? How long did it take to grow your beard that long?" "5 years," Thornwood said. "You don't ever shave it?" "In the mountains, a beard keeps you warm, and there's nobody looking at me to complain about it." "But now we have to look at you every day," Patrick said, with the brutal honesty of childhood. There was a pause. Then, impossibly, the corner of Thornwood's mouth twitched. "Then you'll have to get used to it, won't you?" Margaret felt a laugh bubble up in her chest, the first real laugh in months. It escaped before she could stop it, and she clapped a hand over her mouth. Thornwood glanced at her, and she thought she saw something soften in his expression, something almost like warmth. They stopped for the night as full dark fell, pulling off the trail into a small clearing. Thornwood had a fire going within minutes, his movements efficient and practiced. He showed Daniel and Patrick how to gather the right kind of wood, how to build a fire that would last through the night without constant tending. While the fire burned, he produced salt pork and beans from his supplies. Margaret moved to help with the cooking, grateful to have something useful to do. Together, in companionable silence, they prepared a simple meal. The children ate until they were full, perhaps for the first time in months, then curled up under the blankets Thornwood provided. After they were asleep, Margaret and Thornwood sat by the fire. The flames painted dancing shadows across his bearded face, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Above them, stars were appearing in the clearing sky, more stars than Margaret had ever seen in Boston, where the smoke and lights of the city blocked them out. "Thank you," Margaret said finally, "for the food, for the blankets, for giving us a chance." "No need for thanks. It's what anyone would do." "No," Margaret said firmly. "It's not. Most men walked away today. You didn't. That matters." Thornwood stared into the fire. "Had younger brothers once. Long time ago. They'd be about Daniel's age now if they'd lived. I know what it looks like when kids are hungry and scared. Couldn't walk away from that." "What happened to them?" "War happened. Sickness happened." His voice was flat, emotionless, but Margaret could hear the pain underneath, like bedrock. "Lost a lot of people in the war. Lost more after. That's why I went to the mountains. Up there, the quiet doesn't judge, and the work doesn't ask questions." Margaret nodded slowly. She understood that kind of grief, the kind that made you want to disappear into a place where no one could see your wounds. "What about you?" Thornwood asked. "Your husband?" "Patrick," Margaret said, and the name still hurt even after 4 years. "He was a dock worker in Boston. Good man, strong and kind and honest. There was an accident. A chain broke, a load fell, he was killed instantly." She swallowed hard. "I had 7 children to feed, and no time for grief. Factory work paid barely enough to keep us alive, but it was never enough. Medical bills from the births, rent, everything. The debt just kept growing." "So you came west?" "So I came west. Because even desperate hope is better than certain death." They sat in silence after that, each lost in their own memories. Eventually Thornwood stood and added more wood to the fire. "You should sleep, Mrs. Thornwood. Tomorrow's a harder day of travel. I'll keep watch." "You can't stay awake all night." "Can and will. Someone needs to make sure nothing comes near the camp. I don't need much sleep anymore. Haven't for years." Margaret wanted to argue, wanted to insist that he needed rest too, but exhaustion was pulling at her like a tide. She climbed into the wagon, where her children slept in a tangled pile of limbs and blankets, and for the first time in months, she felt something close to safe. As she drifted toward sleep, she could see Thornwood through the canvas cover, a dark shape silhouetted against the fire, keeping watch over them all. This strange man who had bought them for reasons she didn't fully understand. This man who had seen her family standing on that platform and chosen them when no one else would. It wasn't love, it wasn't even affection, but it was honest, and Margaret had learned to value honesty above almost everything else. She closed her eyes and, for the first time in months, slept without crying. Part 2. Building a Family. Dawn broke over the mountains with a clarity that took Margaret's breath away. The sky blazed pink and gold, painting the snow-covered peaks in colors she had no names for. In Boston, morning had meant gray light filtering through factory smoke. Here it meant the world reborn in fire and ice. Thornwood was already up, had been for hours by the look of things. The fire had been rebuilt, coffee was boiling in a battered pot, and he was checking the horses with the careful attention of a man who knew his life depended on these animals. "Morning," he said without looking up. "We need to move soon. Weather's changing." Margaret couldn't see any difference in the sky, but she had learned in the past day not to question him about the wilderness. He knew this land the way she knew the rhythm of looms and the price of thread. Different knowledge, equally vital. The children woke slowly, cramped and cold, but mercifully still together. They ate a quick breakfast of leftover cornbread and jerky, then climbed back into the wagon. The day's travel was harder than the first, the trail climbing steadily into the mountains. The trees grew thicker here, towering pines that blocked out the sun and turned the world into cathedral dimness. They had been traveling for perhaps 3 hours when Thornwood suddenly pulled the horses to a stop. His whole body had gone rigid, alert in a way that made Margaret's pulse quicken. "What is it?" she asked quietly. "Riders, behind us. Been following for the last mile." Margaret twisted to look back, but saw nothing except trees and snow. "Are you certain?" "I'm certain." Thornwood's hand moved to the rifle beside him. "Could be nothing. Could be trouble. Either way, we keep moving. Mrs. Thornwood, I need you to stay calm and keep the children quiet. If I tell you to do something, you do it immediately. Understand?" "Yes." They continued, the wagon creaking through the snow. Margaret kept glancing back, her heart hammering. And then she saw them, 3 riders emerging from the tree line behind them, moving faster than the wagon could manage. "I see them," she said. "Hold on," Thornwood said grimly. He urged the horses faster, but the wagon was heavy and the trail difficult. The riders gained ground quickly. Within minutes they were close enough for Margaret to see details. 3 rough-looking men on rougher horses, their faces hard and their clothes worn. The lead rider, a thin man with silver hair slicked back under an expensive hat, called out, "Thornwood! Ezekiel Thornwood! Hold up there!" Thornwood kept driving. "I said hold up!" The rider spurred his horse forward, cutting in front of the wagon. Thornwood was forced to stop or run the man down. The 3 men spread out, surrounding the wagon. Margaret pulled the children close, her body instinctively shielding them. She could see Thornwood's hand on his rifle, his face set and cold as the mountains themselves. "What do you want, Hargrove?" Thornwood's voice was flat. The silver-haired man grinned, showing teeth too white and even to be natural. "Now, is that any way to greet an old business associate? I heard you were in Pineville buying yourself a wife, and a ready-made family. Thought I'd ride out, offer my congratulations. Congratulations offered. Now move. Not so fast. Hargrove's eyes slid to Margaret, assessing and dismissive in a single glance. That's the fat woman from the auction, isn't it? The one nobody wanted. You must have been desperate, Thornwood, to pay $150 for that. Margaret felt the words like a physical blow, but she kept her face still. Beside her, Thornwood had gone very quiet, the kind of quiet that preceded violence. You have 5 seconds to move your horse, Hargrove. Or what? You'll shoot me in front of your new wife and all those children? Hargrove laughed. I don't think so. You've gone soft, Thornwood. Time was, you'd have already put a bullet in me. Time was, you'd have been smart enough not to provoke me. The air crackled with tension. One of the other riders, a younger man with nervous eyes, shifted in his saddle. Hargrove, maybe we should— Shut up. Hargrove never took his eyes off Thornwood. Here's the thing, Thornwood. That land of yours sits on a nice water source. Water that runs down to my grazing lands, and I've decided I want it. So I'm making you an offer. $500 for your homestead and everything on it. It's not for sale. Everything's for sale. Question is price. Hargrove gestured at the wagon. See, I'm thinking a man with a new wife and 7 mouths to feed might need cash. Might be willing to sell for a fair price. My land's worth 10 times that, and you know it. Maybe, but it's worth nothing if you're dead. Hargrove's hand moved closer to the gun at his hip. So here's my offer. $500, or I make sure you have an accident on this mountain. Your choice. Margaret felt cold certainty settle over her. This man meant it. He would kill Thornwood, kill her, maybe even kill the children if they got in his way. She could see it in his eyes, the casual cruelty of someone who valued property over life. But she could also see something else. She could see Thornwood's hand steady on his rifle, his body coiled and ready. She could see the other 2 riders' nervousness, the way they kept glancing at each other. And she could see, with sudden clarity, that Hargrove was bluffing. He was afraid of Thornwood. That's why he brought 2 men. That's why he was talking instead of shooting. Mr. Hargrove, Margaret said clearly, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. Hargrove's eyes snapped to her. What? You should leave now. Should I? Hargrove's face darkened. And why is that, woman? Because you're not going to shoot anyone, and you're not going to get my husband's land, and every second you stay here makes you look more foolish. Foolish? Hargrove's voice rose. Woman, you don't know who you're talking to. I know exactly who I'm talking to. A bully and a coward who thinks he can frighten people into giving him what he wants. Margaret straightened, feeling her children pressed against her back, drawing strength from their need for her to be strong. But you picked the wrong people to threaten, Mr. Hargrove. My husband isn't afraid of you, and neither am I. For a moment Hargrove just stared at her, shock and rage warring on his face. Then he started to laugh, a harsh, ugly sound. Well, well, the fat lady's got teeth. That's quite a wife you bought yourself, Thornwood. Pity she won't live long enough to warm your bed. He went for his gun. Thornwood was faster. The rifle came up smooth as water, and the crack of the shot echoed off the mountains. Hargrove's hat flew off his head, the bullet passing so close it must have singed his hair. His horse reared, and the other 2 riders' mounts spooked, dancing sideways. In the chaos, Thornwood had the rifle reloaded and aimed before any of them could draw. Next one doesn't miss, Thornwood said quietly. Now ride. Hargrove's face had gone white. His hand hovered near his gun, but he didn't draw. For a long moment, he and Thornwood stared at each other, a contest of wills that Margaret could feel crackling in the air like lightning before a storm. Then Hargrove jerked his horse around. "This isn't over, Thornwood." "Yes, it is. You come near my family again, I won't aim high. Now get off my mountain." The three men rode away, fast and angry. Thornwood watched them until they disappeared into the trees, then slowly lowered the rifle. His hands, Margaret noticed, were completely steady. "Are they gone?" Rose's voice was small and frightened from the back of the wagon. "They're gone," Thornwood said. He looked at Margaret, and something new was in his eyes. Respect, maybe, or recognition. "You shouldn't have spoken up like that. Could have gotten yourself killed." "Could have. Didn't." Margaret found she was shaking now, the fear catching up with her. He was bluffing. Maybe, maybe not. Thornwood clicked to the horses, getting them moving again. Either way, it was a brave thing to do. Or a foolish one. Sometimes those are the same thing. They drove in silence for a while, putting distance between themselves and the confrontation. Margaret's heart gradually slowed, her breathing steadied. Behind her she could hear the children whispering, processing what had happened. "Will they come back?" she asked finally. "Probably," Thornwood said. His jaw was tight. "Hargrove doesn't let things go. He's been trying to get my land for years. Legal challenges mostly, trying to prove I don't have clear title, that I'm squatting. Never worked. But he's getting desperate." "Yes. Water rights are valuable out here. Mine control the flow to his whole spread. He needs that water, or his cattle operation fails." Thornwood glanced at her. "So he'll keep trying, but now he knows you're not just decoration, that you'll stand. That makes you dangerous to him." Margaret didn't know if that was a compliment or a warning. Maybe both. They pushed hard the rest of the day, Thornwood driving them forward with single-minded determination. The trail climbed higher into the mountains, the air growing thinner and colder. Margaret could see peaks all around them now, white and sharp against the blue sky. As the sun began to set, painting the snow in shades of rose and gold, Thornwood pointed ahead. "There. Home." Margaret looked and saw, nestled in a small valley between protective ridges, a homestead. The house was larger than the cabin she had imagined, built of solid logs with a stone chimney from which smoke curled. Behind it stood a barn and several outbuildings. Rail fences marked cleared land, and she could see the glint of water, the stream Hargrove wanted so badly. It was rough and remote and beautiful in a way that made her chest ache. It was home. The children's exhausted silence broke into excited whispers as the wagon descended into the valley. Even after days of hard travel and the frightening confrontation with Hargrove, the sight of the homestead sparked something in them. Hope, maybe, or relief that their journey was finally ending. Thornwood drove the wagon right up to the house and set the brake. Before Margaret could climb down, he was there, offering his hand. His palm was warm and rough, and she took it without hesitation now, letting him help her to the frozen ground. "Welcome home, Mrs. Thornwood," he said quietly. The words settled over her like a benediction she wasn't sure she deserved. "Thank you." The house was solidly built, chinked tight against the weather, with real glass windows that caught the last rays of sunlight. Smoke rose from the chimney, and Margaret wondered who had laid the fire. "Got someone who comes by once a week when I'm gone," Thornwood explained, reading her expression. "Red Skywalker. He'll have stalked the fire and checked the place. Good man. You'll like him." He opened the door and gestured them inside. Margaret entered first, the children clustering behind her like ducklings. The interior was simple but well made. The main room held a large stone fireplace where a fire crackled welcomingly, a sturdy table with benches, shelves lined with supplies, and a kitchen area with a proper stove. Stairs led up to what must be sleeping quarters. The walls were chinked and solid. The floor was wooden planks instead of packed dirt, and everything was clean and orderly in a way that spoke of careful maintenance. "It's wonderful," Margaret breathed, and meant it. After the tenement in Boston, after the crowded wagon and tiny way stations, this felt spacious and safe. "Upstairs has 2 sleeping areas," Thornwood said, hauling in their meager belongings. "Figured the children could have one side, you the other. I'll take the main room down here." Margaret turned to look at him, surprised. "You don't have to do that. We're married. I understand." "We're married by law, Mrs. Thornwood, but we're strangers by fact." Thornwood set down her trunk with careful gentleness. "I meant what I said on that platform. I'm not offering romance. When and if you're ready for more than a business arrangement, that's your choice to make. Until then, I sleep down here." The respect in his words made Margaret's throat tight. How many men would have insisted on their rights, would have demanded what the law said belonged to them? But Ezekiel Thornwood was giving her space, giving her choice, treating her like a person instead of property. "Thank you," she said softly. Thank you." He nodded once and turned to the children. "All right, you lot. Let's get you settled before full dark. Daniel, Patrick, Benjamin, help me unload the wagon. Rose, Catherine, Annie, help your mother figure out the kitchen. Michael, you can explore, but don't touch anything sharp." The children scattered to their tasks, and Margaret found herself smiling at how naturally they responded to Thornwood's authority. He wasn't harsh, but he was clear, and children responded to clarity the way plants responded to sun. As evening fell and the family worked together to settle in, Margaret felt something loosen in her chest. They were safe. They were warm. They were fed. It wasn't everything, but it was enough. For the first time since leaving Boston, she felt like she could breathe. After the children were settled upstairs, their excited whispers gradually fading into sleep, Margaret came back down to find Thornwood sitting by the fire. He was cleaning his rifle with practiced motions, the firelight playing across his bearded face. "Thank you," she said again, "for today, for all of it." "No need for thanks. It's what family does." "Is that what we are? Family?" Thornwood looked up at her, and in the firelight, his eyes seemed warmer somehow. "Getting there, I think. Takes time to build a family. But we've got time now. That's what today bought us. Time." Margaret sat down across from him, taking up the mending she had brought from Boston. They worked in comfortable silence, the fire crackling between them, and Margaret thought about the word he had used. Time. After years of racing against debt and hunger and desperation, the idea of having time felt like the greatest luxury imaginable. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with a sound like the ocean. Inside, the fire kept the darkness at bay. And somewhere between the two, Margaret O'Brien Thornwood began to believe that maybe, just maybe, they were going to be all right. Part 3. Community and Conspiracy. 3 weeks passed in Black Bear Hollow, and Margaret learned what it meant to survive in the mountains. The work was endless and exhausting, but it was also satisfying in a way factory labor had never been. Here she could see the results of her effort: meals that fed her family, clothes that kept them warm, a house that slowly began to feel lived in and loved. The children adapted faster than Margaret expected. Daniel and Patrick followed Thornwood around with eager questions, learning to split wood and check traps and read the signs that animals left in the snow. Rose became Margaret's right hand, learning to bake bread in the temperamental oven and churn butter and preserve what little food they could store for the lean months ahead. Even the little ones found their place. Benjamin helped with the chickens, his gentle nature perfect for gathering eggs without frightening the hens. Catherine and Annie learned to card wool and wind yarn.
And Michael, at 3 years old, mostly got underfoot. But he did it cheerfully, and Thornwood showed surprising patience with the boys' endless curiosity. On a cold morning at the end of their 3rd week, Thornwood found Margaret struggling with the bread dough. She had been working it for 20 minutes, and it still felt wrong, dense and uncooperative under her hands. "Too much water," Thornwood said from the doorway. Margaret jumped. She hadn't heard him come in. "I followed the recipe exactly." "Mountain air is drier. Need less liquid up here." He moved to the table, his massive hands surprisingly gentle as he added flour to her mixture. "Like this. Feel how it changes?" His hands covered hers, guiding them through the motion. Margaret felt heat rise in her face that had nothing to do with the fire in the stove. This close, she could smell wood smoke and pine sap, and something underneath that was purely him. "I see," she said, her voice coming out softer than she intended. Thornwood stepped back quickly, as if suddenly aware of the intimacy of the moment. "You'll get the hang of it. Everything's different up here. Takes time to learn." He was gone before she could respond, out to check the trap lines he had set in the surrounding forest. Margaret stood alone in the kitchen, her hands still tingling from his touch, and wondered when exactly this business arrangement had started to feel like something more. That afternoon, as she was hanging laundry on the line Thornwood had strung between 2 pines, she heard horses approaching. Her heart jumped into her throat. Hargrove? But no, the rider who emerged from the tree line was alone and elderly, sitting his horse with the easy grace of someone who had been born in the saddle. The man was ancient, his face a map of wrinkles, his hair white as the snow around them. He wore buckskin and fur, and around his neck hung a necklace of turquoise and silver that caught the weak winter sun. His eyes, dark and bright as a bird's, studied Margaret with an intensity that made her feel simultaneously seen and evaluated. "You are the new wife," he said. It wasn't a question. His English was accented, careful, each word precisely placed. "I'm Margaret Thornwood, yes." "I am Red Skywalker, friend to Ezekiel since he was a boy grieving his mother." The old man dismounted with surprising agility for someone who must have been 70 at least. "I came to see if the dream was true." "Dream?" "3 weeks ago, I dreamed of Ezekiel standing with 8 people, 1 woman with hair like fire, 7 children like 7 stars. It was a sign. The family he lost would return, in a different form." Margaret felt something catch in her chest. "He told you about his wife and daughter?" "He told me nothing. The grief told me everything." Red Skywalker moved closer, his sharp eyes taking in details Margaret wasn't sure she wanted seen. The fading bruises on her wrists from Boston, barely visible now. The way she held herself, ready to defend or flee. The worn patches on her dress that she had mended so many times, the fabric was more thread than cloth. "You have been hurt," he said quietly. "Not by Ezekiel, by the world before him. The world is hard on women with no husbands and too many children. The world is blind." Red Skywalker reached into a pouch at his belt and produced a small clay pot. "For the bruises, willow bark and bear grease. We'll heal what remains." Margaret took it with trembling hands. "Why are you helping me? You don't know me." "I know you are here. I know my friend chose you when he had chosen no one for 5 years. I know the children upstairs laugh, and this house has not heard laughter since the sickness came." The old man smiled, and it transformed his weathered face. "That is enough to know." They heard Thornwood returning before they saw him, his boots crunching through the snow. He came around the side of the house with a brace of rabbits over his shoulder, then stopped short when he saw Red Skywalker. "Old man," Thornwood said, and there was warmth in his voice that Margaret had never heard before. "I wondered when you'd come snooping around." "Not snooping, visiting. There is a difference." Red Skywalker switched to another language, fluid and musical, and Thornwood responded in kind. They spoke for several minutes while Margaret watched, fascinated. She had known Thornwood was half Cherokee, but hearing him speak the language, seeing the way his whole bearing changed, was like seeing a different person entirely. Finally, Red Skywalker switched back to English. "She is good, Ezekiel. The dream was right. Do not let fear make you stupid." "I'm not afraid," Thornwood said, but his eyes cut to Margaret and away again, and she saw the lie in his face. "You have been afraid since Mary died, afraid to live, afraid to hope, afraid to let anyone close." The old man's voice was gentle but implacable. "This woman and these children are a gift. Do not waste it." Thornwood's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Instead, he turned to Margaret. "We need to go into town tomorrow, supplies and other business. I want you to come." "All of us?" "You, me, and the 3 oldest. The others can stay with Red Sky. He'll keep them safe." The way he said it made Margaret's stomach clench. "What's happened?" "Hargrove's been busy. I got word yesterday. He's filed papers with the county court. Claims I'm holding you against your will. Claims the children are in danger." Thornwood's voice was tight with controlled fury. "He's trying to use the law now instead of bullets." Red Skywalker spat into the snow. "Hargrove is like a cancer. Grows and spreads and kills everything it touches." "We knew he'd try something," Margaret said, but her hands had gone cold despite her mittens. "What do we do?" "We go to town. We show them you're here by choice. We show them the children are healthy and safe." Thornwood met her eyes. "And we start building our defense, because this won't be the last move he makes." They left for Pineville at dawn the next morning, the wagon loaded with furs and dried herbs that Thornwood planned to trade. Rose, Daniel, and Patrick sat in the back, their eyes wide as they watched the mountains fall away behind them. Margaret sat beside Thornwood on the bench, wrapped in a coat he had given her that was too large but wonderfully warm. The town looked different in the weak winter sunlight, less desperate somehow. Or maybe Margaret was the one who had changed. She walked beside Thornwood down the main street with her head high, and when people stared, she met their eyes without flinching. They stopped first at the general store, a weathered building that smelled of coffee and tobacco and leather. The proprietor, an elderly man named Perkins, looked up from his ledger and his eyes went wide. "Thornwood! Lord have mercy, I haven't seen you in 3 years." "Been busy," Thornwood said. "Need supplies, and my wife needs fabric." The word wife hung in the air like smoke. Perkins's gaze shifted to Margaret, taking in her worn dress and red hair, and the children clustered around her. "Wife?" Perkins repeated carefully. "Heard you got married. Didn't believe it, truth be told." "Believe it," Thornwood said flatly. "We need 20 pounds of flour, 10 of cornmeal, salt, coffee if you have it, and whatever fabric Mrs. Thornwood chooses." While Thornwood conducted his business, Margaret moved to the bolts of cloth stacked against one wall. Her fingers traced the materials longingly. She hadn't had new fabric in years, had been making do with mending and scraps and desperate ingenuity.
Beautiful, isn't it? Margaret turned to find a woman standing beside her, perhaps 45, with kind eyes and hair going gray at the temples. She wore a simple but well-made dress and an apron that proclaimed her as someone who worked for a living. "Yes," Margaret said, cautiously. "I'm Sarah Combs. I run the boarding house on 4th Street. The woman smiled. "You're Margaret Thornwood. The whole town's been talking about you." "I imagine they have." Margaret's voice came out harder than she intended. "Oh, don't pay them any mind. Small towns love to gossip, especially about people they don't understand." Sarah moved closer, her voice dropping. "I wanted you to know, not everyone believes what Hargrove's been saying. Some of us, we know what kind of man he is, and some of us think you were very brave to come here with 7 children and make a new life." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "You don't think I'm a fool? Desperate? Taking advantage of Thornwood?" Sarah shook her head firmly. "I think you're a mother, doing whatever it takes to keep her family together. That's not shameful. That's the bravest thing a woman can do." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I know what it's like to be judged by people who don't know your story. My husband died 5 years ago, left me with debts I'm still paying off. People said I should remarry, should find a man to take care of me, as if I couldn't take care of myself." Sarah's expression hardened. "And because Hargrove tried to force me to sell my boarding house to him. When I refused, he started rumors that I was running a brothel. Nearly destroyed me. But you survived." "I survived, and you will too. But you need to know what you're up against. Hargrove has friends in the county courthouse. The judge, Morton, owes him money. The prosecutor is his nephew. They're going to make this hard for you." Margaret felt cold dread settle in her stomach. "What should we do?" "Get a lawyer, a good one, from outside the county if you can, and start gathering witnesses, people who can testify that you're here willingly, that the children are well cared for." Sarah pressed something into Margaret's hand, a slip of paper with a name written on it. "This man, Dr. Samuel Miller. He's a drunk, but he's a good man underneath, and he hates Hargrove more than anyone I know. He might help you." Before Margaret could respond, Thornwood appeared at her elbow. "Ready?" Margaret nodded, clutching the paper. As they left the store, she glanced back to see Sarah watching them with an expression that was part hope, part worry, part something that looked like prayer. Their next stop was the courthouse, a stolid brick building that dominated the town square. Inside, the air was cold and smelled of paper and old wood. A clerk directed them to a small office where Deputy Luther Cobb sat with his boots on the desk, picking his teeth with a splinter. "Well, well," Cobb said, not bothering to stand. "The happy couple. Heard you were coming." "We're here to see the papers Hargrove filed," Thornwood said. "Don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do. The claim that I'm holding Mrs. Thornwood against her will, that the children are in danger. I want to see the actual documents." Cobb smirked. "Those are official court documents. Can't just show them to anybody." "I'm not anybody. I'm the man being accused." "Still can't help you. Unless—" Cobb's eyes slid to Margaret, lingering in a way that made her skin crawl. "Maybe if the lady asked nicely." Thornwood moved so fast, Margaret barely saw it. One moment he was standing beside her, the next he had Cobb by the front of his shirt, lifting the smaller man half out of his chair. "You look at my wife like that again,"
Thornwood said, his voice barely above a whisper. And they'll be picking your teeth up off the floor. Understand? Cobb's face had gone white. You can't threaten a law officer. I'm not threatening. I'm promising. Thornwood released him with a shove that sent the deputy sprawling back into his chair. Now get us those papers, or I'll go over your head to the sheriff. It took another 20 minutes and the threat of involving Sheriff Brennan, who apparently had more integrity than his deputy. But eventually they got copies of the documents. Margaret read them in growing horror. The accusations were carefully worded to sound concerned rather than malicious, but the intent was clear: to paint Thornwood as dangerous and Margaret as a victim who needed rescuing. He's claiming we're not legally married, Margaret said, her voice shaking. That because you're Cherokee, the marriage violates state law.
Kentucky has laws against interracial marriage, Thornwood said grimly. But we're not married, not really. The contract was for employment, not marriage. Then we need to change that, said a voice from the doorway. They turned to find an elderly man standing there, his clothes rumpled, his face lined with age and something that looked like old sorrow. He carried a black medical bag and smelled faintly of whiskey and peppermint. Dr. Samuel Miller, the man said, extending a hand. And before you ask, yes, I'm the drunk Sarah Combs told you about. But I've been sober for 6 months, and I still remember how to practice medicine. More importantly, I know how to testify in court. Why would you help us? Margaret asked. Miller's face went hard. Because 10 years ago, Hargrove poisoned the water supply at one of his mines to force the workers to quit so he could hire cheaper labor. 12 men died, including my 8-year-old son. I couldn't prove it. Started drinking instead. Been trying to destroy him ever since, in my own pathetic way. He looked at Thornwood. But you? You might actually succeed, and I want to help. They talked for over an hour, there in the cold hallway of the courthouse. Miller explained the legal strategy Hargrove was using, the precedents he would cite, the witnesses he would call. He outlined a defense that would require Margaret and Thornwood to actually marry, to make their arrangement legal and unassailable. But there's a problem, Miller said. Even if you marry, Hargrove will argue that Thornwood forced you into it, that you're too afraid to refuse him. You need to prove that you're here willingly, that you chose this life. How do we prove that? Margaret asked. You tell your story, publicly, at the hearing next week. Miller looked at her seriously. And you convince them that you're not a victim, that you're a woman who made a choice and stands by it. Miller paused, then added, There's one more person who might help. Jacob Perkins. Old Jake. He was the best lawyer in 3 counties before he retired. If anyone knows how to navigate these anti-miscegenation laws, it's him. But he hasn't practiced in 10 years, not since Hargrove ruined his son's business. I don't know if he'd be willing to come out of retirement. We have to try, Margaret said. They rode back to Black Bear Hollow in silence, each lost in thought. The mountains rose around them, white and eternal, and Margaret found herself thinking about choices and consequences and the strange paths that led people to each other. Maggie, Thornwood said suddenly, and it was the first time he had used the shortened form of her name. About this marriage, I meant what I said before. I won't force you into anything. If you want to fight this some other way. There is no other way, Margaret interrupted. Is there? No, he admitted. Then we do what we have to do. Margaret looked at him, this man who had bought her on a platform and given her dignity, who had protected her family and asked nothing in return. But Ezekiel, if we do this, if we make it real, I need to know something.
Is this still just a business arrangement to you, or has it become something more? Thornwood was quiet for so long, Margaret thought he wouldn't answer. Then, I told myself it was business. Told myself I was just being practical, that I needed help running the homestead. But that was a lie. I saw you standing there with those children, saw the way you held yourself, even when the world was breaking you, and I saw possibility. Saw maybe a second chance at something I thought I'd lost forever. Family, Margaret said softly. Family, Thornwood agreed. Not the one I lost, a different one, but family just the same. Margaret reached across the space between them and took his hand. His fingers, rough and scarred, closed around hers with surprising gentleness. Then let's make it real, she said. Let's build this family and fight for it and show Hargrove and everyone else that we're not something to be broken. You're sure? I've never been more sure of anything in my life. When they reached the homestead, Red Skywalker was waiting on the porch with the 4 younger children. The old man took one look at their faces and nodded as if confirming something he had already known. The dream continues, he said. Good. Tomorrow we prepare for battle. Tonight, we celebrate what remains. That night, around the fire, with all 7 children fed and warm and safe, Margaret sat beside Ezekiel Thornwood and felt something shift inside her. This was her family now. This strange, cobbled-together collection of souls who had found each other in the midst of desperation and decided to hold on. It wasn't what she had planned. It wasn't what she had imagined when she boarded that train in Boston. But it was real, and it was worth fighting for. And that, Margaret decided, was all that mattered. Part 4. Marriage and Betrayal. The wedding took place 3 days later in Reverend Hayes's small church, with only Red Skywalker, Dr. Miller, and Sarah Combs as witnesses. There were no flowers, no music, no white dress. Margaret wore her cleanest garment, the dark blue wool she had mended so many times, and Ezekiel stood beside her in a shirt he had clearly borrowed because it was too small across his massive shoulders. But when Reverend Hayes asked if she took this man as her husband, Margaret's voice rang clear and strong through the empty church. I do. And when Ezekiel repeated the words back to her, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch, she believed him. This wasn't the romantic wedding she had dreamed of as a girl in Boston. It was better. It was real. Red Skywalker stepped forward after Hayes pronounced them married, holding a bundle of sage that he lit with a match from his pocket. The smoke curled upward, sweet and sharp, as the old man spoke in Cherokee. Ezekiel translated in a low voice. He's blessing the union, asking the spirits to protect our home and our family, asking them to give us strength for what's coming. What is coming? Margaret whispered. War, Ezekiel said simply. They returned to Black Bear Hollow to find the 4 younger children in a state of barely contained excitement. Rose had kept them occupied with chores and games, but the moment the wagon came into view, they swarmed out of the house like bees from a hive. Are you really married now? Catherine asked, her 5-year-old face solemn. Like proper married? Proper married, Margaret confirmed, gathering the little girl into her arms. Which means Mr. Thornwood is your father now, if you'll have him. Catherine considered this seriously, then turned to look at Ezekiel, who stood awkwardly by the wagon, clearly uncertain of his place in this moment. Will you teach me to whistle? She asked. Papa used to whistle, but he's gone now, and nobody can teach me. Something in Ezekiel's face cracked open. He knelt in the snow, bringing himself to Catherine's eye level, and the gesture was so careful, so tender, that Margaret felt her throat close with emotion. "I'll teach you to whistle," he said, "and to track rabbits, and to tell which stars are which, if that's what you want." "I want that," Catherine said, and threw her small arms around his neck. One by one, the other children came forward. Benjamin, who wanted to learn about horses. Annie, who asked if he would sing the Cherokee song again. Even Michael, barely 3, toddled over and demanded to be picked up. Ezekiel lifted the boy with the ease of long practice, settling him on one broad shoulder, and Michael laughed with delight. Only Daniel and Patrick hung back, the 2 oldest boys caught between childhood and something harder. They had lost their father. They remembered him. The question in their eyes was clear. Could they accept this stranger as a replacement, or would that be a betrayal of the man who had come before? Ezekiel saw it too. He set Michael down gently and moved toward the boys, his movements slow and non-threatening, as if approaching wild animals that might spook. "I'm not trying to replace your father," he said quietly. "No one could do that. But I can be someone who teaches you what he would have taught you if he'd lived. Someone who stands beside you when the world gets hard, if you'll let me." Daniel looked at Patrick. Patrick looked at Daniel. Some wordless communication passed between them, the kind only brothers can share. Then Daniel stepped forward and extended his hand. "Teach us to be men," he said, his young voice cracking slightly. "The kind of men our father would have been proud of." Ezekiel took the offered hand and shook it with the gravity of a general accepting a treaty. "I'll do my best." The first week of their marriage passed in a strange rhythm of normalcy. They worked side by side, establishing routines, learning each other's movements in the kitchen, the way Ezekiel took his coffee black and scalding hot, the way Margaret hummed Irish ballads while she kneaded bread. The children watched them with hopeful eyes, waiting to see if this new arrangement would hold or shatter like so many promises before. On the 8th night, after the children were asleep, Margaret came downstairs. The first week of their marriage passed in a strange honeymoon of normalcy. They worked together establishing routines, dividing labor, learning each other's rhythms. Margaret discovered that Ezekiel was an early riser who liked his coffee black and his breakfast hot. Ezekiel learned that Margaret sang while she worked, old Irish ballads her mother had taught her, and that the sound made the house feel alive in a way it hadn't been for years. They still slept separately, Ezekiel on his bedroll by the fire, Margaret in the small room upstairs. But there were moments when their hands would brush as they reached for the same dish, when their eyes would meet across the dinner table, and Margaret would feel heat spread through her that had nothing to do with the fire. On the 8th night, after the children were asleep, Margaret came downstairs to find Ezekiel sitting by the fire, staring into the flames. She had learned that this was when the ghosts visited him, when the memories of his first wife and daughter became too heavy to bear alone. "Tell me about them," she said, settling beside him. "Mary and Emma, if you want to." Ezekiel was silent for so long, Margaret thought he would refuse. Then, "Mary was small, delicate, nothing like you. She hated the mountains, missed Philadelphia where she grew up. But she stayed because I loved it here, because she loved me enough to live somewhere she hated." His voice was rough with old pain. "Emma was 6 when they died, just starting to read. She had Mary's dark eyes and my stubbornness. Used to follow me everywhere, asking why about everything." "Like Catherine," Margaret said softly. "Like Catherine."
Ezekiel's hands clenched into fists. "I was in France when they got sick. The influenza. By the time the army sent me home, they'd been dead 3 months, buried together in the churchyard. I never got to say goodbye." Margaret reached out and covered one of those massive fists with her hand. "I'm sorry. Everyone said I should move on, should find another wife, have more children. But how could I? How could I replace them?" "You're not replacing them, Ezekiel. You're making room for something new. Love isn't a finite thing. Having more doesn't diminish what came before." Ezekiel looked at her then, really looked, and Margaret saw something in his expression that made her heart race. "When did this become love?" he asked quietly.
"I don't know. Maybe when you gave my children honey cakes. Maybe when you stood between me and Hargrove's gun. Maybe it happened so gradually I didn't notice until it was already done." Maggie. Her name on his lips was a question and an answer and a plea all at once. "I'm afraid." "So am I. But I think maybe brave is just another word for being afraid and doing it anyway." He kissed her then, tentative at first, as if she might break. But Margaret wasn't delicate. She kissed him back with all the hunger and hope and desperate joy of a woman who had been alone too long. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Ezekiel pressed his forehead against hers. "I'm still sleeping down here tonight," he said. "We'll go slow. Do this right." "We'll go slow," Margaret agreed, though her whole body was singing with wanting him. For 3 nights they existed in that strange space between promise and fulfillment. Ezekiel taught Daniel and Patrick to track deer. Margaret preserved the last of the autumn vegetables. The house settled into the rhythms of winter. And every evening, as the fire burned low and the children slept, Margaret and Ezekiel would sit together, hands touching, hearts waiting. But they didn't get the chance to go slow or fast or anywhere at all, because 3 nights later, everything changed. Margaret woke to the smell of smoke. She was on her feet and moving before her mind fully processed the danger. Years of caring for children having trained her to respond to threats instantly. She threw open the door of her room to find the house filled with gray haze, thick enough to sting her eyes and catch in her throat. "Fire!" she screamed. "Ezekiel, fire!" She heard him moving below, heard the crash as he kicked open the door. Then he was up the stairs, moving through the smoke with the sureness of someone who could navigate his own home blind. "Get the children out," he commanded. "The back window. I'll get them down." Rose was already awake, already gathering the younger ones. Daniel and Patrick stumbled from their corner, coughing. Margaret did a quick count. 7. All 7 accounted for. Thank God. The back window opened onto the sloped roof of the lean-to. Ezekiel went through first, dropped to the ground with cat-like grace despite his size, then reached up. "Pass them down!" One by one, Margaret and Rose handed children through the window. Catherine, crying but brave. Annie, clinging to Rose's neck. Benjamin, Michael, Patrick. Daniel insisted on jumping himself, proving his newfound manhood. And finally Rose, who didn't want to leave her mother, but obeyed when Margaret gave her no choice. "Now you," Ezekiel called up. "I'm coming." Margaret took one last look behind her. The smoke was thicker now, and she could see the orange glow of flames eating through the downstairs. Everything they owned was in this house. Everything except what mattered most. She climbed through the window, felt Ezekiel's hands close around her waist, solid and safe. He lifted her down as easily as he had lifted the children, and she found herself pressed against his chest, his heart hammering under her cheek. "Everyone here?" he asked, his voice sharp. "Everyone," Rose confirmed. "Into the barn, now. Stay together and stay quiet." "Why quiet?" Daniel asked, but Ezekiel was already moving, not toward the barn, but toward the tree line, his rifle materializing in his hands from wherever he had stashed it. Because this wasn't an accident. Margaret understood that with cold certainty as she herded the children across the snow. The fire had started in multiple places. She had seen the separate glows through the smoke. This was arson. This was attempted murder. This was Hargrove. They made it to the barn, and Margaret pushed the children into an empty stall, piling hay around them for warmth and concealment. Rose understood without being told that they needed to be invisible. She gathered the little ones close, one hand over Michael's mouth to muffle his frightened whimpers. Margaret crept to the barn door and peered out. The house was fully engulfed now, flames reaching for the sky like grasping fingers. In the firelight, she could see 3 figures moving near the tree line. 3 men who thought they had murdered a family in their sleep. A shot rang out, and one of the figures dropped. Ezekiel, picking off targets with the precision of a man who had learned to kill in the trenches of France. The other 2 scattered, firing wildly into the darkness. But Ezekiel was invisible, part of the mountain itself, and they were exposed against the snow. Another shot, another body falling. The 3rd man panicked and ran. Ezekiel let him go. Margaret understood why. A survivor to carry the message back to Hargrove. This family would not die easily. But as Ezekiel stepped out of the trees, moving toward the barn to check on them, the surviving arsonist made a fatal mistake. He stopped running, turned back, and fired one desperate shot. Margaret saw Ezekiel stumble, saw the dark stain spreading across his left shoulder, saw him go down to one knee in the snow. She didn't remember moving, didn't remember crossing the space between the barn and where he fell. She was just suddenly there, her hands pressing against the wound, her voice high and thin with panic. "Ezekiel! Oh God! Ezekiel!" "I'm all right," he gritted out, but his face was gray with pain. "Just a graze. Help me up." It wasn't a graze. Margaret could feel the bullet lodged in the meat of his shoulder, could feel the blood hot and slick under her fingers. But she helped him to his feet because they couldn't stay here, exposed in the open, with the house burning and enemies potentially still in the woods. "Rose!" Margaret called. "Bring the medical kit and blankets." Her daughter emerged from the barn, pale but composed, carrying the supplies they kept for emergencies. Behind her, the other children huddled in a frightened mass. Margaret wanted to comfort them, to tell them everything would be fine. But she couldn't lie. Not now. "Daniel," she said instead, "you're the man of this family tonight. I need you to take your brothers and sisters into the root cellar behind the barn. Lock the door from inside. Don't open it for anyone except me or your father. Understand?" "Yes, ma'am." Daniel's voice shook, but he moved immediately, gathering his siblings. Patrick started to protest, but one look from Daniel silenced him. When they were gone, Margaret turned her full attention to Ezekiel. Red Skywalker had taught her some field medicine, and her years of stitching wounds in Boston had given her steady hands. But this was different. This was the man she loved, bleeding in the snow, and her hands wanted to shake. She made them steady through sheer force of will. "This is going to hurt," she warned. "Already hurts," Ezekiel said through gritted teeth. Margaret used her knife to cut away his shirt, exposing the wound. The bullet had entered high on his shoulder, missing the lung but lodging deep. She poured whiskey over her hands and his torn flesh, feeling him tense against the burn. Then, with a prayer to whatever saint watched over desperate women, she dug her fingers into the wound. Ezekiel made a sound like an animal caught in a trap. His good hand clamped down on her wrist hard enough to bruise, but he held still. Margaret felt the bullet, slippery and wrong under her fingertips, and pulled it free in a gush of fresh blood. "Got it," she gasped. "Good." Ezekiel's voice was faint. "Now stitch it. Fast. Before I pass out and can't appreciate your handiwork." It was a poor attempt at humor, but it was enough to steady her. Margaret threaded her needle with the same focus she had used for mending clothes, for stitching her husband's dock wounds, for all the small repairs that had made up her life. But this mattered more than any of those. This was Ezekiel. This was her heart walking around outside her body, and she would be damned if she let him bleed out in the snow. 16 stitches to close the entry wound, 8 more for the exit. By the time she finished, dawn was breaking over the mountains, painting the smoke from their burning house in shades of pink and gold. Ezekiel had gone gray-faced and silent, hovering on the edge of consciousness. "Stay with me," Margaret commanded, wrapping his shoulder in clean bandages. "Ezekiel, stay with me. I need you. The children need you. You don't get to leave us now." His eyes fluttered open, those pale winter eyes focusing on her with effort. "Bossy woman," he murmured. "You have no idea." Margaret helped him to his feet, taking most of his considerable weight. "Can you walk? Can you stop me?" Together they made it to the root cellar. Margaret knocked the pattern she had taught Daniel, 3 quick raps, pause, 2 more. The door opened, and 7 frightened faces peered out. "Papa!" Catherine cried, and suddenly all the children were swarming around them, touching, checking, needing to confirm that their family was still intact. "I'm all right," Ezekiel said, though he was swaying on his feet. "Everyone's all right. That's what matters." But as Margaret looked at their burning home, at the blood soaking through the bandages on Ezekiel's shoulder, at her children's terrified faces, she felt rage ignite in her chest hotter than any fire Hargrove could set. "This isn't over," she said quietly. "No," Ezekiel agreed. "But Maggie, we can't fight him. Not like this. He has the law, he has money, he has men. We have—" He gestured weakly at their ragged family, at their destroyed home. "We have truth," Margaret interrupted, "and we have each other. And that's going to have to be enough. Because I will not let that man destroy what we've built. I will stand in front of every judge in Kentucky if I have to. I will tell our story until someone listens. And I will not stop fighting until he's the one bleeding in the snow." Ezekiel looked at her, and despite the pain etched in every line of his face, he smiled. "Remind me never to make you truly angry." "Too late," Margaret said. "I'm already furious. And Silas Hargrove is about to learn what happens when you threaten a mother's family." Part 5. The Trial. The courtroom in Pineville was packed to capacity on the morning of February 14, 1923. Every seat was filled, and people stood 3 deep along the back wall, craning their necks to see the spectacle. A mountain man accused of kidnapping, a fat woman nobody wanted, who claimed she had chosen this life. 7 children caught in the middle. It was the most entertainment the town had seen in years. Margaret sat at the defendant's table, wearing a dress that Sarah Combs had loaned her. Dark green wool that was only slightly too large. Beside her, Ezekiel filled his chair like a bear forced into human furniture, his wounded shoulder bandaged beneath his coat. Dr. Miller sat on Margaret's other side, sober and sharp-eyed, with a stack of papers that represented their defense. Across the aisle, Silas Hargrove lounged in his seat like a man attending the theater. His lawyer, Clayton Winters, was a sleek man from Lexington with a silver tongue and a reputation for winning impossible cases. Behind them sat Deputy Cobb and 3 other men Margaret didn't recognize, all ready to testify to Hargrove's version of events. Judge Morton presided from his bench with the weary expression of a man who would rather be anywhere else. He was old, his face a map of broken blood vessels that spoke of too much whiskey and too little conscience. Everyone in the courtroom knew he was in Hargrove's pocket. The only question was whether he would at least pretend to be impartial. "This court is now in session," Morton intoned, banging his gavel. "The matter before us is the petition of Silas Hargrove, concerned citizen, regarding the welfare of Margaret O'Brien and 7 minor children currently residing with Ezekiel Thornwood. Mr. Winters, you may proceed." Winters rose with the fluid grace of a man who lived in courtrooms. "Thank you, Your Honor. Gentlemen of the jury, the case before you today is quite simple. A vulnerable woman, widowed and desperate, was purchased like livestock by a man of questionable character and mixed race. She and her innocent children were then taken to an isolated location where no one could hear their cries for help. My client, Mr. Hargrove, seeks only to ensure that this woman is here of her own free will and that these children are not in danger. He painted Ezekiel as a dangerous recluse, emphasized his Cherokee blood in a way that made it sound like a crime, suggested that Margaret was too frightened to tell the truth. It was a masterful performance, full of righteous concern that would have been convincing if Margaret hadn't known the truth. When Winters finished, Dr. Miller stood to present their defense. He was older, shabbier, less polished, but there was steel in his voice when he spoke. "Your Honor, what we have here is not a rescue mission, but a land grab. Mr. Hargrove wants Ezekiel Thornwood's property, specifically the water rights. When Mr. Thornwood refused to sell, Hargrove turned to the courts, using this woman and these children as pawns in his game." Miller gestured to Margaret. "But Mrs. Thornwood is no pawn. She is a woman who made a choice, who married legally, and who stands here today to tell you that she is exactly where she wants to be." The first witness Winters called was Deputy Cobb, who testified that he had received numerous reports of screaming coming from the Thornwood property, that he had seen Margaret looking frightened and bruised on her trip to town. All lies, but delivered with such conviction that Margaret saw several jurors nodding. Then Winters called a man named Jenkins, who claimed to be a former neighbor of Ezekiel's. "Thornwood's a violent man," Jenkins said. "Saw him beat a man half to death outside a tavern once, just for looking at him wrong. And everyone knows Indians can't be trusted. It's in their blood." Ezekiel's jaw tightened at the slur, but Dr. Miller put a hand on his arm, steadying him. They had known this would be ugly. They had prepared for the racism and the lies, but preparation didn't make it easier to sit silent while strangers defamed you. When it was their turn, Miller called Reverend Hayes first. The minister took the stand with obvious reluctance, clearly uncomfortable being caught between truth and politics. "Reverend Hayes, you conducted the bride auction where Mr. Thornwood met Mrs. O'Brien, correct?" "I did." "And you witnessed the contract they signed?" "Yes." "Was there any indication that Mrs. O'Brien was being coerced?" Hayes hesitated. "No, she accepted his offer of her own free will." "And when they returned to be married, Did she seem frightened? No, Hayes admitted. She seemed content, happier than at the auction. Winters jumped up for cross-examination. But, Reverend, isn't it true that abused women often hide their fear? That they learn to smile even when they're suffering? I suppose that's possible, Hayes said uncomfortably. And isn't it true that Mr. Thornwood is known to be violent and unstable? I wouldn't say. Please answer the question, Reverend. Yes or no? Hayes looked miserable. He keeps to himself. Some people find that unsettling. It went on like that for 3 witnesses. Sarah Combs testified that Margaret seemed healthy and well treated, but Winters got her to admit she had only seen Margaret twice. Red Skywalker spoke about Ezekiel's character, but Winters dismissed him as a savage whose word meant nothing. Even Dr. Miller's testimony about treating Ezekiel's bullet wound, which proved they had been attacked, was twisted into evidence that violence followed Thornwood wherever he went. By midday, Margaret could see the trial slipping away from them. The jury, 12 white men from town, looked skeptical at best and hostile at worst. Judge Morton had overruled nearly every objection Miller made, while sustaining all of Winters's. This was a performance, not a pursuit of justice, and everyone knew it. Then Miller called Margaret to the stand. She walked to the witness box on trembling legs, feeling every eye in the courtroom tracking her movement. She knew what they saw. A fat woman in a borrowed dress, uneducated, unimportant, easy to dismiss. She had been dismissed her whole life. But Margaret O'Brien Thornwood was done being dismissed. Mrs. Thornwood, Miller began gently, would you tell the court how you came to be in Kentucky? Margaret took a breath and began. She told them about Boston, about Patrick's death and the debt and the factory work that destroyed her hands and barely fed her children. She told them about the Bride Bureau's promises and the train ride west, and standing on that platform while 52 men rejected her. And then Ezekiel Thornwood offered me a choice, she said. Not the choice between him and someone better. The choice between him and losing my children forever. Between hope and despair. Between a chance at life and certain death. And you took that chance, Miller said. I took that chance because I am a mother, and a mother will do whatever she must to keep her children safe. Winters was on his feet immediately for cross-examination. He circled Margaret like a shark scenting blood, his questions sharp and designed to humiliate. Mrs. Thornwood, isn't it true that you were so desperate you would have gone with anyone? I was desperate, Margaret agreed, but I chose Ezekiel Thornwood specifically, because I saw something in him that the other men lacked. And what was that? The ability to pay more than anyone else? Decency, Margaret said firmly. Honor. The willingness to take on 7 children nobody wanted and treat them as if they mattered. Or perhaps you saw a lonely, isolated man who could be manipulated. If I wanted to manipulate a man, Mr. Winters, I would have chosen someone far easier than Ezekiel Thornwood. A ripple of laughter went through the courtroom. Winters's face reddened. Isn't it true that you're afraid of your husband? No. That he beats you? Never. That he forces himself on you? Never. Margaret's voice rose. Ezekiel Thornwood is the most honorable man I have ever known. He gave me choice when I had none. He gave my children safety when the world wanted to scatter them. He married me to protect me from men like Mr. Hargrove. And if you think I'm here under duress, if you think I'm too frightened or too stupid to know my own mind, then you understand nothing about women or strength, or what it means to survive. The courtroom had gone silent. Winters opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Finally, he said, "No further questions." But as Margaret stepped down from the witness box, Winters called out, "Actually, Your Honor, I have one more question for the witness." Margaret stopped, turned back. "Mrs. Thornwood, are you aware that marriage between races is illegal in Kentucky? That your marriage to a half-Cherokee man is not recognized by law?" Margaret felt the trap spring shut. If their marriage wasn't legal, then the contract wasn't valid, and she and the children could be removed from Ezekiel's care. If the marriage was legal, then they had violated state law and could both be prosecuted. But before she could answer, a voice called out from the back of the courtroom, "The marriage is perfectly legal under the Treaty of 1817. Every head turned. An elderly man in a fine suit was making his way down the aisle, carrying a leather satchel bulging with documents. He was perhaps 70, with white hair and sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. "And who are you?" Judge Morton demanded. "Jacob Perkins, Your Honor, attorney at law. I apologize for my tardiness. I was researching relevant case law." He reached the front of the courtroom and began pulling papers from his satchel. The Treaty of 1817 between the United States and the Cherokee Nation specifically guaranteed that Cherokee people who married white citizens and adopted civilized ways could maintain property rights. The Kentucky Anti-Miscegenation Law of 1866 did not supersede federal treaties. Therefore, the marriage between Ezekiel Thornwood, who is half Cherokee, and Margaret O'Brien, who is white, is perfectly legal. Winters looked like he had been struck. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular." "It's also correct," Perkins said mildly. "I have the treaty documentation right here, along with 3 precedent cases from Tennessee and North Carolina. Would you like to review them?" Judge Morton looked at the papers, looked at Hargrove's furious face, looked at the jury. Margaret could see him calculating, trying to find a way to rule for Hargrove without making himself look corrupt. "I'll need to review these documents," Morton said, finally. "Court is adjourned until tomorrow morning." The gavel's crack echoed through the courthouse like a gunshot. As they filed out into the cold February afternoon, Margaret could feel eyes following them, some sympathetic, others hostile. The battle was far from over. That night, they stayed at Sarah Combs's boarding house. The children were crammed into one room, exhausted and frightened. Ezekiel paced like a caged animal, his wounded shoulder clearly paining him. Margaret sat by the window, watching the street below, waiting for Hargrove's next move. "Who was that lawyer?" she asked. "Perkins?" "Old Jake," Ezekiel said. "Used to be the best attorney in the county before he retired. I didn't know he was coming." "I asked him," said a voice from the doorway. Red Skywalker entered, moving silently despite his age. "Told him it was time to stop hiding. Time to fight." "Thank you," Margaret said. "Do not thank me yet. Tomorrow will be harder. Hargrove knows he is losing. Desperate men do desperate things." The old Cherokee was right. When they returned to the courthouse the next morning, the atmosphere had changed. There was violence in the air, a crackling tension that made Margaret's skin prickle. Hargrove's men filled the back of the courtroom, and they looked less like witnesses than like a lynch mob waiting for permission. Judge Morton took his seat with obvious reluctance. "Having reviewed the documents submitted by Mr. Perkins, I am prepared to rule.
The marriage between Ezekiel Thornwood and Margaret O'Brien is legal under federal treaty law. However, this court must still determine whether Mrs. Thornwood is here of her own free will and whether the children are in danger. "Your Honor," Winters said quickly, "I would like to call the children to testify." "No," Margaret said, standing before Miller could stop her. "You will not question my children. You will not use them as weapons. If you have questions, ask me. Ask Ezekiel. But leave the children alone." "Mrs. Thornwood, sit down," Morton ordered. "I will not." Margaret's voice rang through the courtroom. "I have sat quietly while you called me a victim and my husband a monster. I have listened to lies and slander and bigotry. But I will not let you traumatize 7 children who have already suffered enough." "Bailiff, remove this woman," Morton said. But before the bailiff could move, something extraordinary happened. Sarah Combs stood up in the gallery. "She's right. Leave those children alone." Then another woman stood, and another. Within seconds, half the women in the courtroom were on their feet, a silent wall of solidarity. And then the men began to stand. First old Jake Perkins, then Reverend Hayes, then a dozen others. People who had sat silent through the trial were finally finding their voices. "Enough!" a man called from the back. Margaret recognized him as one of the miners from Hargrove's operation. "We all know what this is about. Hargrove wants Thornwood's land. The rest is theater." "That's not true," Hargrove said, standing. "I'm only trying to protect—" "You're trying to steal," the miner interrupted. "Like you stole from us. Like you've stolen from every man in this town who was weak enough to let you." The courtroom erupted into chaos. Voices shouting, people arguing, Judge Morton banging his gavel uselessly. And in the middle of it all, Margaret looked at Ezekiel and saw him smiling. "What's funny?" she asked. "This," he said. "All of this. We're not alone anymore, Maggie. We never were. We just didn't know it." It took an hour for order to be restored. When the courtroom finally quieted, Judge Morton looked exhausted and defeated. He glanced at Hargrove, at the angry crowd, at the papers old Jake had provided, and Margaret saw him make his calculation. "This court finds that Margaret Thornwood is here of her own free will," Morton announced, "that her children are well cared for, that the marriage between Mrs. Thornwood and Mr. Thornwood is legal. Case dismissed." The courtroom erupted again, but this time in cheers. Margaret felt Ezekiel's good arm come around her, pulling her close. She buried her face in his chest and let herself shake with relief. They had won. Against all odds, against money and power and bigotry, they had won. But as they left the courthouse, Hargrove blocked their path. His face was purple with rage, and his hand hovered near the gun at his belt. "This isn't over, Thornwood," he hissed. "You've made an enemy today. A powerful enemy." "No," Margaret said, stepping between them. "You made an enemy. You came after my family. You tried to burn us alive. You dragged us through court to humiliate us. And you lost. Now get out of our way, or I'll make you regret the day you learned my name." For a moment, Hargrove looked like he might draw his gun. But there were too many witnesses, too many people watching. With a final venomous glare, he shouldered past them and disappeared into the crowd. "Is he really gone?" Rose asked, emerging from Sarah's boarding house with her siblings. "For now," Ezekiel said. "But Red Sky was right. Desperate men do desperate things. We need to go home. We need to rebuild. And we need to be ready, because this war isn't over. Not yet." But as they loaded into the wagon for the long ride back to Black Bear Hollow,
Margaret looked at her family, her strange, cobbled-together, beautiful family, and felt something settle in her chest. They had survived. They had fought. They had won. Whatever came next, they would face it together, and that was all that mattered. Part 6. Home at last. Spring came to Black Bear Hollow like a resurrection. The snow retreated inch by stubborn inch, revealing earth that had been frozen for months. Green shoots pushed up through the mud, defiant and hopeful. The stream that Hargrove had coveted so desperately ran high with snowmelt, clear and cold and singing over the rocks. And on the blackened foundation where their house had stood, Ezekiel Thornwood swung an axe, cutting timber for walls that would rise again. He was not alone. The people who had stood up in that courtroom came to help. Miners who hated Hargrove.
Farmers who respected a man willing to fight for his family. Even some of the women from town, Sarah Combs and her friends, arrived with food and determination. They worked through March and into April, raising walls and laying floor joists, and building something that was more than just a house. They were building a statement, a declaration that community mattered, that a family who had been broken could be made whole. Margaret worked alongside them, her hands blistered and her back aching, but her heart fuller than it had been in years. She learned to notch logs and drive pegs and mix mortar. Rose worked beside her, no longer a child, but a young woman learning that strength came in many forms. The boys hauled stones for the chimney, their backs growing strong from labor. Even the little ones helped, carrying tools and fetching water, and providing laughter when the work grew hard. By May, the house was finished. It was larger than the original, with 3 bedrooms upstairs and a proper kitchen that made Margaret want to weep with joy. The barn had been repaired, new chickens pecked in the yard, and on the day they moved back in, Red Skywalker blessed the threshold with smoke and prayers in Cherokee that needed no translation. Home, safety, family. The words were universal. That night, after the children were asleep in their new rooms, after the last of the helpers had ridden back to town, Margaret and Ezekiel stood on the porch watching the sun set behind the mountains. His arm was around her shoulders, hers around his waist, and the silence between them was comfortable as an old quilt. "I never thanked you," Margaret said quietly, "for choosing me that day in Pineville, for seeing something in me that no one else could see." "I should thank you," Ezekiel countered, "for giving me a reason to live again, for reminding me that family isn't just blood, it's choice. Every day we choose each other. That's what makes it real." Margaret turned to look at him, this man who had been a stranger 6 months ago and was now the center of her world. "I love you, Ezekiel Thornwood. I need you to know that, not because you saved me, but because of who you are. The man who sings Cherokee lullabies to children who aren't his by birth, but are his by choice. The man who rebuilds when the world burns him down. The man who taught me that strong doesn't mean hard, and gentle doesn't mean weak." Ezekiel's winter-pale eyes were bright with emotion. "I love you too, Maggie. Loved you from the moment you stood up to Hargrove on that mountain road. Probably loved you before that, but I was too stubborn to admit it." He cupped her face in his scarred hands. "You made me remember how to hope, how to want tomorrow. That's a gift beyond price." He kissed her then, deep and slow and full of promise. And when he pulled back, he took her hand. "Come with me." He led her inside, past the main room where embers glowed in the new fireplace, up the stairs to the bedroom they had been sharing since the house was completed. It was simple. A bed they had built together,
a chest for clothes, a window that looked out on the mountains. But it was theirs, their sanctuary, their beginning. "Maggie," Ezekiel said, and there was vulnerability in his voice she had never heard before. "I want this to be real, not just legal, not just practical, real in every way. But only if you want it too. I need you to say it. I need to know you're choosing me, not just accepting what circumstances gave you." Margaret understood what he was asking, what he was offering. The final wall between them, coming down. "I choose you," she said clearly. "I choose this. I choose us." What happened next was tender and awkward and beautiful. Two people who had both loved before, both lost before, finding each other again in the darkness. Learning each other's bodies with the wonder of explorers discovering new territory. There was laughter when Ezekiel's wounded shoulder protested. There were tears when emotion became too much to contain. And there was joy, pure and uncomplicated, in the simple act of being together. Afterward, they lay tangled in quilts Margaret had sewn, her head on his chest, his hand stroking her hair. Through the window, moonlight painted the mountains silver, and an owl called from the forest. "Do you think Hargrove will come back?" Margaret asked. "I don't know. Part of me hopes he's learned his lesson. Part of me knows men like that never learn." Ezekiel's voice was thoughtful. "But I'm not afraid anymore. Whatever comes, we'll face it. Together." "Together," Margaret agreed. Summer brought more changes. The garden Margaret planted grew with almost violent enthusiasm, vines climbing and spreading and producing more vegetables than they could possibly eat. She learned to preserve food in the root cellar, to smoke meat in the little shed Ezekiel built, to make cheese from the milk cow old Jake Perkins gifted them. Daniel and Patrick spent their days learning from Ezekiel, becoming skilled with traps and tracking, and all the small skills that meant survival in the mountains. But Ezekiel also insisted they continue their schooling. Margaret taught them reading and arithmetic every evening, and Red Skywalker taught them Cherokee. So they grew up speaking 3 languages: English, Irish Gaelic from Margaret's songs, and Cherokee from their adopted grandfather. Rose had become a woman seemingly overnight. At 14, she was tall and capable and beautiful in a way that made the young men in town stare when they went for supplies. But she had no interest in leaving. Black Bear Hollow was home now, and she told Margaret she wanted to be a teacher someday, to help other children the way her mother had helped her. The younger children bloomed like wildflowers. Benjamin discovered a gift for working with animals, gentle hands that could calm the most skittish horse. Catherine learned to whistle, just as Ezekiel had promised, and filled the house with music. Annie sang constantly, Irish ballads mixing with Cherokee chants in a hybrid that belonged to no culture and all cultures at once. And Michael, growing from toddler to boy, followed Ezekiel everywhere like a devoted shadow. In July, Margaret realized she had missed 2 monthly courses. She said nothing at first, afraid to hope, afraid to jinx the possibility. But by August, there was no denying it. She was pregnant. She told Ezekiel one evening after the children were asleep, taking his hand and placing it on her still, flat belly. "There's going to be another one," she whispered. "Come next spring." Ezekiel went very still. His eyes searched hers, looking for doubt or fear. "Are you happy about it?" "Terrified," Margaret admitted. "But yes, so happy I can barely breathe. Are you?" In answer, Ezekiel lifted her into his arms and spun her around the kitchen, laughing like a man half his age. When he set her down, his eyes were wet. Another chance, another little person to teach and love and watch grow. "Maggie, you've given me everything." "We gave each other everything," Margaret corrected. The pregnancy was easier than Margaret's previous ones, perhaps because she wasn't also working 16-hour factory shifts and starving herself to feed her children. She grew round and healthy, and Ezekiel treated her like she was made of spun glass, which she found both endearing and annoying. "I'm pregnant, not dying," she told him when he tried to stop her from carrying a basket of laundry. "I know. He trailed off, and Margaret saw the fear underneath. The memory of Mary dying while he was across an ocean. The terror that history might repeat itself. "I'm not Mary," Margaret said gently. "And this isn't 1918. I'm strong, Ezekiel, and I'm not going anywhere." But in November, her certainty was tested. The baby came early, arriving 6 weeks before expected during the first blizzard of winter. Margaret woke in the pre-dawn darkness to pain that bent her double, water soaking the bed, and the terrifying knowledge that something was wrong. "Ezekiel," she gasped, "the baby's coming. Too soon. It's too soon." He was on his feet immediately, moving with the practiced efficiency of a man who had learned to function under pressure. "Rose," he bellowed, "get Red Sky. Daniel, ride to town. Get Dr. Miller." "You can't ride in this storm," Margaret protested through gritted teeth. "The snow." "I can and I will," Daniel said, already pulling on his coat. At 12, he was nearly as tall as Ezekiel and twice as brave as he had any right to be. "Hold on, Mama. Help is coming." He was out the door before she could stop him, into a storm that was dropping snow so thick you could barely see 3 feet ahead. Ezekiel carried Margaret downstairs to the warmth of the main room, settling her on the bed they kept there for cold nights. Rose appeared with clean linens and hot water, her young face set with determination. "Tell me what to do, Mama," she said. "You shouldn't have to do this," Margaret said, but another contraction cut off her words. "I'm 14, Rose said firmly. "Old enough. Now tell me what to do." So Margaret told her. How to check the baby's position, how to know when to push, how to cut and tie the cord. All the desperate knowledge she had gathered over 8 births, delivered by other women in tenement rooms and factory dormitories. Rose listened with the fierce concentration of someone taking notes for an examination she couldn't afford to fail. Red Skywalker arrived within the hour, snow covering him like a cloak, and he brought medicines Margaret didn't recognize. Bitter teas that eased the pain, poultices that helped her dilate, prayers in Cherokee that felt like protection. The labor lasted 14 hours. 14 hours of pain that threatened to split Margaret in half. 14 hours of Ezekiel holding her hand, his face gray with fear, while Rose followed Red Sky's instructions with steady hands. 14 hours of wondering if she would survive this, if the baby would survive, if she had come all this way only to die in childbirth like women had been dying since the beginning of time. And then, just as the sun was setting and turning the snow outside to rose gold, the baby came. Too small, too quiet, not breathing. Red Skywalker moved with surprising speed for an old man. He cleared the baby's mouth and nose, rubbed the tiny chest with hands that had delivered countless children over 7 decades, and after an eternity that lasted maybe 30 seconds, the baby gasped and cried, thin and angry and alive. "A daughter," Red Sky announced. "Small but strong, like her mother." Ezekiel was crying openly now, tears streaming into his beard. Margaret took her daughter with trembling hands, this tiny scrap of life that weighed maybe 4 pounds, and felt her heart expand to dimensions she hadn't known were possible. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "Welcome to the family."
They named her Sarah, after Margaret's mother, and Red Skywalker gave her a Cherokee name as well, Morning Light, for the way the sun had broken through the storm at the moment of her birth. Dr. Miller arrived 3 days later, having been trapped by the storm in a line shack halfway to Black Bear Hollow. He examined both Margaret and the baby with professional thoroughness. "You're lucky," he said. "Both of you. Another hour in that storm, and Daniel would have frozen.
Another hour of labor and you might have hemorrhaged. But you're going to be fine. The baby too, though she'll need careful feeding. Premature infants are fragile." "She's a thornwood now," Ezekiel said, cradling Sarah in his massive hands with infinite gentleness. "We don't break easily." Winter deepened, and Sarah grew. Slowly, ounce by precious ounce, she put on weight and became less fragile. Margaret nursed her constantly, giving her body over to the demanding work of keeping this tiny life alive. The other children were fascinated by their new sister, taking turns holding her, singing to her, competing for who could make her smile first. It was Patrick who won that competition, making ridiculous faces until Sarah's mouth curved into what was unmistakably a grin. He crowed with triumph, and the whole family celebrated as if he had won a great battle. In February, on the anniversary of the trial, Sheriff Tom Brennan rode up to Black Bear Hollow with news. Silas Hargrove had been arrested. Not for what he had done to the Thornwoods, but for something that could actually be proven: embezzlement. He had been stealing from his own mining company, siphoning funds to support his land acquisition schemes. One of his partners had discovered it and gone to the authorities. "He'll be tried in Lexington," Brennan said, "far enough from here that he can't buy the judge. He's looking at 10 years minimum." "Good," Margaret said simply. The years that followed were not easy, but they were good. Each season brought its own challenges: harsh winters that tested their stores, dry summers that made the stream run low, the endless work of keeping a homestead alive. But through it all, the family that had been forged in desperation grew stronger. After Brennan left, Margaret stood on the porch. "I wanted to apologize," Brennan continued. "I knew Hargrove was crooked. Should have stopped him years ago. But I was afraid of losing my job, of what he might do to my family. I was a coward." "You're here now," Ezekiel said. "That counts for something." After Brennan left, Margaret stood on the porch, watching spring return to the mountains. Sarah slept against her shoulder, warm and solid and real. Behind her, she could hear her family: Rose teaching Catherine to braid hair, Daniel and Patrick arguing good-naturedly about who was better at tracking, Benjamin talking to the horses in that gentle voice he used with all animals, Annie singing, Michael laughing at something only 3-year-olds found hilarious, and Ezekiel moving through the house he had built, the home he had made for all of them. "You're crying," he said, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her and their sleeping daughter. "Happy tears," Margaret said. "I was just thinking about that day in Pineville, standing on that platform with everyone looking at me like I was worthless. 52 men who walked away." "Their loss," Ezekiel said firmly. "I used to think I was the woman nobody wanted. Used to believe what they said about me, that I was too fat, too burdened, too much. But I wasn't too much. The world was just too small." She turned in his arms, looking up at this man who had changed everything. "You saw me when no one else could. You gave me more than a home. You gave me back myself. And now look at us. Look at what we built. Ezekiel kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. We built it together. That's what makes it matter. Not that I saved you or you saved me, but that we saved each other. And we keep choosing each other every single day. Every single day, Margaret agreed. Years passed. Sarah grew into a beautiful child with her father's pale eyes and her mother's red hair, belonging to two worlds and comfortable in both. Daniel went off to study law, determined to be the kind of attorney who defended people like his family. Rose became a teacher just as she had dreamed, opening a small school in Pineville that taught both white and Cherokee children, shocking the town and changing it in small but important ways. Patrick became a forest ranger, protecting the mountains he loved. Benjamin opened a veterinary practice, the first in 3 counties. Catherine married a good man and had children of her own, teaching them to whistle just as Ezekiel had taught her. Annie's voice became famous in the county, singing at churches and celebrations, her Irish-Cherokee blend of music unlike anything anyone had heard before. Michael followed in Ezekiel's footsteps, becoming a hunting guide who taught city folk how to survive in the wilderness. Margaret and Ezekiel grew old together in the house they had built, watching their family expand and flourish. They buried Red Skywalker when he died peacefully in his sleep at age 89, and they mourned him as they would have mourned their own father. They celebrated when Hargrove died in prison, and neither of them felt guilty for the relief they felt. The years between Sarah's birth and Margaret's final days were filled with the small miracles that make up a life well lived. First words and first steps. Weddings held in the meadow behind the house. Grandchildren who climbed the same trees their parents had climbed. Winters survived and springs celebrated. Each day was a choice to love, to work, to stand together. And each day, that choice became easier, until it was simply who they were. They worked their land and loved their children and grandchildren, and proved every single day that family was what you made it, not what blood gave you. And on quiet evenings, when the work was done and the children were grown and gone to their own lives, Margaret and Ezekiel would sit on their porch watching the sun set behind the mountains, and Margaret would remember that terrified woman on a platform in Pineville. That woman who had been rejected and dismissed and told she was worthless. That woman had been wrong about herself, and more importantly, the world had been wrong about her. She wasn't the woman nobody wanted. She was the woman who had built an empire of love from nothing but determination and hope. She was the woman who had taught 7 children that strength came in many forms. She was the woman who had stood in a courtroom and demanded to be seen. She was the woman who had loved and been loved in return. She was Margaret O'Brien Thornwood, and she was exactly enough. On her deathbed at age 78, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who filled the house to bursting, Margaret held Ezekiel's hand and smiled. "Did we do good?" she asked, her voice thin with age, but still clear. "We did perfect," Ezekiel said. He was 89 now, bent with age, but still strong, still steady. "We built something that will outlast us. Can you hear them?" Margaret listened to the voices in the house below, laughter and argument, and the sound of a baby crying and being comforted, the sound of family, the sound of home. "I can hear them," she said, "and it's beautiful." "Maggie, I need to tell you something," Ezekiel said, and his voice cracked. "That day in Pineville, I didn't choose you randomly. I had been watching the auction from the back, watched all those men walk away, and I kept thinking,
If one more man rejects her, I'm going to step in. Because I saw something in your eyes. I saw fight. I saw fire.
I saw a woman who had been beaten down by the world but refused to break. And I thought, that's the woman I want beside me. Not in spite of everything she'd been through, because of it. Because survival makes you strong. Margaret smiled, tears tracking down her wrinkled cheeks. You never told me that. Saving it for when it mattered most. Wanted you to know, before the end, that you were always wanted. From the very first moment. You were always enough. Always more than enough. You were everything. So were you, Margaret whispered. So were you. She died peacefully that night, Ezekiel holding her hand, surrounded by the family she had built from desperation and hope and love. And though there was grief, there was also celebration, because Margaret O'Brien Thornwood had lived a life that mattered. She had taken nothing and made it into everything. She had been rejected by 52 men and chosen by one, and that one choice had changed the world. Not the whole world, perhaps, but the world that mattered, the world of one family in the mountains of Kentucky, who learned that love wasn't about blood or beauty or what society said you should be. Love was about choice, about standing together when everything tried to tear you apart, about building something that would outlast you and leave the world better than you found it. Margaret O'Brien Thornwood, the woman nobody wanted, had done exactly that. And in the end, that was all that mattered.